I'm going to show you one of the most multi-purpose tool in Duik, the connector, which, as its name indicates, is used to connect things together in Duik in After Effects. So let me show you with something very simple. Let's animate together the position, scale, and rotation of this cube. For example, so that it moves like this. And this is a single animation which I'd like to control in a simpler way, especially to handle the interpolations while keeping all of these synchronized. So I can just select the keyframes and click on connector. By just doing this, we have the same animation, but now in the effects, you have this connector effect, which is a property which is connected to the three others made to control all of them together. And with these keyframes, which are just a simple % value, I can adjust the animation and especially change the interpolation while keeping perfectly in sync the three properties we have animated. So we can connect like this as many properties as we wish, even if they're not in the same layer or even not in the same composition. It works across compositions and pre-compositions if you need. So this way you can control a whole animation made of many properties, but with a single property. This is how the connector works. It uses a master property to control other slave properties altogether. So here it's the simple way to do that with a single slider. But in the options, you have many other possibilities to create the controls you need. Let me show you. For example, you have on the first line the sliders, which may be 1 dimension, 2 dimension sliders, or an angle. They're used to control animations right from the composition. For example, they're used a lot to rotate a head on all possible axes. I'm going to use this simple slider to animate the hand of this character, closing and opening. So first we need the animation of the hand. So for this, I'm just going to select the layer and convert it to vector shape layer to be able to animate the path of the hand and animate the fist opening and closing by just animating the path very quickly. Okay, and once we have the animation, we can use the connector to control this hand as we wish. In the connector panel, I'm going to go to the options again and click on the slider button to create the slider in the composition, which I can move where I want by moving the background below the actual slider, which is this circle we're going to animate. Everything is set up automatically because Duik knows what this is. It just created it, so everything is automatically set up to be ready. And now I can just select the properties to connect properties. And by just doing that, when I move the slider, I control the animation of the hand. This is how you can use this slider. And you have also 2D sliders, which you could call joysticks too, which are used for exactly the same, except that you can connect both the vertical and horizontal axis to 2 different animations. It is very useful to turn the head, for example, which is going to turn from left to right and from up and down, so that you can control both axes with this single controller. Let me just show you on a very simple example, this square here, where I'm going to use a 2D slider. Let's move it on the corner and animate the position first of this square and maybe an animation in the rotation. And what we can do is connect the x-axis of this slider to the rotation, for example. And now we can connect the vertical axis to the position. To make this new connection, let's just select the slider and get back to the options of the connector. And don't click on to the slider, we're not creating a new one, we're picking an existing control. So here we can just select the y-axis this time, because it's the y-axis we want to use to control the position. And just be careful, when you select the slider, do not move it, because instead it's the position which is selected. Just click on the layer in the timeline to actually select the layer and not just its position. And Duik will understand that what we're connecting is the whole thing and not just the position. So just really click on the layer and not in the viewport. And then I can select the y-axis. The minimum and maximum values are -100 and 100. That's the default for the sliders. If Duik doesn't input these values for you, just input them manually, -100, 100, and select the position to connect it. And now, by doing this, I can control both the position with the vertical axis and the rotation with the horizontal axis. Here it's reversed. If that happens, you just have to reverse the keyframes so that it's the right side. And now I can use this slider to control both properties together. So these are the sliders. And there's a third one, which is the angle, which is quite the same thing. Let's create one here and move it. And this is the same, except you're going to use the rotation to control what you need to control. It works the same way. For example, here, I can use this angle controller to control the opacity of this square. Why not? Let's just add a couple of keyframes on the opacity. And then here it's ready because I've just created it. I can connect the opacity to this angle. And now when I select the controller and rotate it, I control the opacity of the square. It's another way to animate, which is very handy because rotations are easy to animate in After Effects. So why not using this control, especially for cycles, because after one turn you get to the original value. It's a cycle, so it may be useful to animate loops, for example, or any cycling property, because the connector ignores the count of the turns and connects only the value from 0 to 360. So, for example, here, let's modify the opacity animation. To modify it, I just need to deactivate the expression so that I'm able to edit the keyframes. And now I get from 100 to 0 and back to 100. And now I can reactivate the expression. And now, as you can see, I can use this angle controller to cycle this animation by just changing the value. Duik ignores the count, the number of rotations, of turns, of complete turns. So the angle may be useful to control cycles like this. And then there is this very specific tool, the Expose Transform tool, which exposes the transform of layers. For example, if I'd like to use the transformations of these two layers to connect to control something. For example, if I need to use the distance between them to control this new circle. So let's use the opacity, for example. That's what I'm going to control, the opacity of the circle. And using the Expose Transform tool, we can connect the opacity of the circle to the distance between these two layers. Let's just select them and click on Expose Transform. Then Duik creates this layer on top of one of the two layers, which has the Expose Transform effect, which shows lots of values between the two layers, which is the target, and a reference you can choose, which is the parent by default, but we can here select the rectangle instead, for example, and just uncheck Use Parent. And now, let's move this layer anywhere. You'll see that it's going to measure lots of different stuff. For example, here, the distance in 2 dimensions between the two layers we've chosen, so that when they move, then you have this distance, which is evaluated live. You also have the angles between the two layers, or here the angle formed by the 3 layers, this angle here, which is difficult to compute, but here it's done for you with a simple expression. And you have a lot of information like this on this layer. Let's just hide the guides. And now that I've set up this in the connector, I can just select the 2D distance, which is the default because it's the most used, to connect the opacity. We just need to select the minimum and maximum value of this distance so that it works correctly. So the maximum distance, let's say it's this 666. And the minimum distance, let's say it's here, so it's 200 approximately. And then I can next connect this opacity to this distance measured by my tool. And now I control the opacity of the circle. It is controlled by the distance between the two other layers, which is measured by this ruler here, which measures all kinds of things between two layers. Again, I can just reverse the keyframes if I wish, that it becomes transparent when the other are close together. So this is a tool which is not used very much. We almost forget it exists, but it's very, very useful because it gives us lots of different values which may be very useful to connect them or to use in our own expressions, which work no matter the parent links between the layers or other expressions. So you have all this information which may be very useful exposed by this expose transform tool. You can also connect layers to a list of layers. So it's the same principle. We are going to create a control, which is the list, to control the opacity of layers. For example, in this robot, you have many different mouths, which are pre-composed here. And to select the mouth I want to display, I can use this tool, creating a list on this controller, for example. This layer is the controller for the mouse, and let's just add a layer list on it. So it's set up automatically, and I can just, in the mouse composition, select the layers and click on Connect. And by just doing this, on the controller for the mouse, I now have this list with the list of the mouse correctly named, and I can very easily select the mouse I'd like to show. So it's really simple, but very useful. So this is the layer list. The effector is another tool which may be very useful. You can use with many different things. Let me show you the principle here with this small square. I'm going to animate its color and its rotation, for example. And then let's just duplicate this many times. So here I have 40 of them. Let's just move them. I can just select all their positions and use Duik in the automation panel. You have a randomize tool to input random values in the selected properties. So here in the position, I'm going to add this random value. And now I can use the connector and its effector. So let's just select all these keyframes, all the properties which have been animated. And in the constraint panel, in the connector, let's just click on effector. And you understand right away how it works. You have this effector layer on top of the composition, and if you move it, it controls the animation. It uses the keyframes to control the rotation and the color in this example. What's interesting is that you can, of course, adjust the limits of the effector with a transition between the outer and inner radius. And here it's a circle, but it could also be a line. And this is infinite. It means there's no limit to this line, but you can rotate it. And of course, the same way, adjust the limits like we did with the circle. So this is very, very useful to control lots of layers together according to their location in the composition. You could even parent the effector to move it according to other layers. And you can even use a custom shape instead of a line or a circle. By default, it's a square, but you can adjust the Bezier path of this custom shape so that you have the shape you wish, really precise, and you can use, again, the transition using the limits. And you can animate this shape, for example, or move the effector to have this as you wish. This is a very powerful tool again. Be careful, it has a bad impact on the performance. But if you use for a single animation instead of 40 layers, it can be useful and not so heavy. So the effector controls animations according to the locations. It's a spatial tool. Here I'm moving the effector. You could also use it as an area in where the layers move. And when they move inside the area, then they change and gets back to their original values outside of the area. So you could also use it to move the layers or animate the effector. Both. You can do both. If you use the texture, it's very similar to the effector, but instead of using vectors, it's going to use a texture, an image. For example, let's create a black and white simple image, like a checker, for example. Let's just remove the effector we did before and select this new texture and click on pick texture. So the texture is selected. I can now just connect to the same properties I've used with the effector just before. So let's select them. There is an expression error because we removed the effector, but they're going to be replaced by the texture connector. And now the layers are controlled according to the texture layer. When it's white, you have one value. When it's black, you have the other. And you can move either the image or the layer. And the image controls, the texture controls the animation on the squares. You can select the channel if you wish to change. By default, it's a luminosity, which makes more sense. And of course, it works if, for example, you have gray values. Let's use a blur on this checkerboard. And if you have gray values, it controls the animation. Just be careful to pre-compose your layer if it's a shape layer, so that the effects work correctly. It's always better to pre-compose vector layers for this kind of animation. You can also use not an image, but the audio, the sound, to control the animation. For example, here I have this square and a sound. So this is Chibi Ninja by RxLab under a Creative Commons license. And we're going to use this sound to control the animation of the rectangle. For example, if I wanted to jump, I'm going to animate its position on the y-axis. And maybe with other sound, I can control its rotation or its color. We can do anything. Let's just animate the rotation. And why not animate the color also? And then I can just select this layer and click on Pick Audio. And the connector creates everything I need, and now I just select the properties I want to control. Let's first control the position, and click on Connect Properties to connect the position to this audio layer. For now, nothing happens, because I need to adjust the settings inside the pre-compositions the connector created. This is the composition where I can control the audio connection. Duik creates an audio spectrum with two controllers. The speakers contains the general settings in its effects. For example, here I can see the spectrum is very small. I can use the amplitude to make it clearer. It depends on the audio and the sound you're using, so I can just set this. And then I can use the ear layer where I need the connection. So, and by just choosing the note I want to connect, I can just move the ear on the spectrum so that the cube is going to jump on this specific note. And by just doing this, on this note, the cube jumps. And of course, I can adjust the interpolation of this animation. Here it's very fast, but I can raise the ease value here to have a longer transition. And now you have a better motion. This can be improved again, because here the connection is very precise. The cube jumps on a very specific note, but if the frequency changes, it doesn't move. If I want the cube to jump on more notes, on a wider range of frequencies, on the audio spectrum layer, I can just add a blur effect. Be careful, as this is a shape layer, you have to uncheck the repeat edge pixels value. And let's just use a horizontal blur so that the range is wider, and move the ear in between, in the middle values, so that the cube now jumps on all notes. So this is how you can synchronize very easily in animation to the music very easily. And we can do the same for the rotation and the color, for example, with another connector. Let's just select the sound layer again and pick audio again to create another connection. And this time I'm going to select the rotation and the color and connect. And I have a second composition to adjust the settings. Here I want to connect to the lower frequency, so I can change here the minimum and maximum frequencies to isolate the area which I want to work with and be more precise. so that you can, like this, very easily connect an animation to a sound, a music. And this is a visual controller, which makes it very easy to adjust and set. And finally, a last example of what you can do with the connector with an existing controller. For now, we've always created new controllers to connect something. We can also use existing properties and controllers. Let's get back to this character and isolate the right arm. I'm just going to read this very quickly. Okay, and we're going to use the connector very easily to fix the shape of the arm, of the elbow, when it bends, so that we have a precise control on the shape of the arm, and the same when we pull it to stretch the arm. We could improve this using the connector. So very simply, I'm just first going to create a small animation to manually improve the shape of this arm. So I'm animating the position of the controller to bend the arm and see what's going on. And I'm just going to change the shape of these layers to fix the elbow. For that, I can just create shape layers from these Illustrator layers, so that I can just animate the path manually. So this is to fix the shape of the elbow, but it's also a way to change the shape of the arm when it bends, for example, to add folds on the cloth or muscles or anything you would like to change when the arm bends. And all of this will be linked to the movement of the controller. If I need, I can even add intermediary keyframes. So this can be very, very detailed. You can add as many details as you wish. The only thing you have to make sure is that all the animations have exactly the same duration. So you just have to add a keyframe at the beginning and the end, so that they all have the exact same duration. And this way I can really customize very precisely all the shape, the animation of this elbow. And then, when I'm finished, I just need to connect this animation to what I need, which is not the position of the controller, because what is bending the arm is not specifically the position of the controller, because, for example, I could animate using FK, so it could be the rotation values. So what I'm selecting is the layer and not the position of the layer. And because this is an ARM controller, Duik is going to understand what I'm trying to do, and that what I want to connect is not the position, but the IK itself to this animation. So I just select the layer and click on Pick Control. Duik finds the IK and uses by default the IK length, which is the distance between the shoulder and the wrist, which is exactly what I need. So the minimum and maximum value are also automatically set because there is a small animation. So I just need to select the controlled properties, the children, the slave properties, and next, connect them. And this is very simply. And with this, just make sure you keep the keyframes on the connected properties, because Duik needs these keyframes to animate all of this, but on the controller, now I can uncheck the animation of the position, remove the keyframes, because what I want is to actually animate and manipulate this the way I want, and now the shape of the elbow automatically adapts to the movement of the arm. And we can use the same technique for the stretch, for example. Let's add a couple of position keyframes on the controller again to pull the arm, so we have this stretch. And to animate this stretch, I could just use transform properties in the groups of the shape layer. I could just add a new group to add everything in it and just animate the scale of this group to stretch the arm. And now, again, I'm just going to show the animation. Be careful because there are two animations. One is already connected, so to not mix them up, I can just move the keyframes in the timeline to separate them. And what's nice is also, for example, to use labels on these keyframes to differentiate them easily. Just select a very different color. And it also helps selecting the properties you need to connect. And now I can just select the controller, get back to the connector to pick control again. Just make sure you don't select the position, but the layer itself. And then I'm just going to connect, and I have these upper and lower stretches to connect them. Upper is the arm, lower is the forearm. So let's connect the upper stretch first. and just select the corresponding animation on the arm layer. So next, and connect properties. And let's do the same with the lower stretch. So pick control again with the controller layer selected, select the lower stretch and connect it to the forearm animation for the stretch. Okay, and now I can remove the keyframes, the reference keyframes which were on the controller, and now I can manipulate the arm any way I want, and I can have a nice elbow and a stretch. So this is very powerful. The connector is a very multi-purpose tool. You can use anytime you have a cause and effect connection to do. So in many different cases, it's going to be useful. Sometimes you may need to have multiple connections to the same child-slave property. In this case, you can use the list to combine multiple connections in the same property. Let me show you very quickly. Here I have this position, and there already is an expression and keyframes. I can just add the list. Then in the position, there's only the list, and we're not going to work in the position, but in the effects, I now have a position list with 5 slots. In the first, Duik transferred the keyframes and the expression which were originally in the position, and now I can use the second value, the second slot, to do a second connection in the same position. And I can do this 5 times, or even more, because you could even duplicate the effect to have 10 slots, and more if you need. So the list is very useful to combine expressions, keyframes, connections. But it doesn't work on Bezier path. But if you have a Bezier path, you could also use Duik pins to convert this Bezier path to actual layers. And then the layers can be parented or have lists, so that you can really do any connection you'd like and multiply connections in the same object, in the same property. You can do lots of different things. And we'll see in a future tutorial that you can even use this connector with the key morph, which is new in Duik Ángela, and another way to connect and control properties, especially Bezier path, but not only Bezier path. So we'll see in another tutorial how to combine the connector and this new key morph. Let's rig the head of the character. We're going to use a lot the connector in Duik. So let me just show you what we're going to do. We have this controller to rotate the head in fake 3D on both axes. Of course, you can move the eyes, blink, and with an individual control for each eyelid, if you need. A controller to control both eyelids at once. Something to move precisely the mouth. And select the shape of the mouth you need. To prepare the rig of this character, I'm not going into After Effects right now, but I want to show you how I built the selector for the mouth. So here I'm in Krita and not Photoshop, but both are very similar and it's the same technique, but I do prefer a lot Krita, which is much more powerful than Photoshop and free and open source. So my advice is to use this instead of Photoshop. And you can even export your files to the Photoshop format to import them in After Effects. So here for the mouth, you'll see in the layers that there's a group for the mouth with all the mouth stacked together. So I'm just going to duplicate this group, move it with the controller layers on top of the document, and move this group here beneath the other controllers. The important thing to know is that your selector needs to be a grid with perfect squares so that it works in After Effects with the connector. So here I need 8 slots, so let's do just 2 columns of 4 items. So I'm just drawing a reference to make sure the mouths are correctly located. And let's move the mouse in the grid. And we have an empty item, which can be used to just hide the mouse if we need during the animation. And now let's just draw a better grid so it looks nicer, because this vector grid is ugly. So you don't actually need to do that, it's just so that it looks better. And now I can just flatten this group because it's just a reference, a guide, and let's just rename it. So now I have a single layer. And then I need the actual controller, which is a layer on top of this reference. And let's just draw the controller I want as a selector. So it can be anything you'd like. It can be a frame around the shape, or what I like is to draw a filled square and use a blending mode to do the selection. I think this is nice and easy to animate. You just have to move this square to select the mouth you'd like. So this is an example on how you can customize the controllers to be used with Duik. It's very simple and very light for After Effects. It's lighter than shape layers, so don't hesitate to build your custom controllers as you wish. And now I can just export this file to the Photoshop format so that I can import it in After Effects. That's it. We're now ready to get back to After Effects to rig this head. To learn how to do this kind of head rig, you can follow the official and comprehensive video course about Duik Ángela available on RxLaboratory.org. Let's have a look at the rig of this arm, which, without the connector in a simple rig, has a lot of issues because of the anchor points and the way these layers are designed. So the shape is wrong when the arm bends and when the hand rotates. So we're going to use the connector to easily have a more detailed arm with better deformations and shapes. This is the same arm, rigged with the connector to improve the shapes. And as you can see in this version, when the arm bends or when the hand rotates, the shape adapts. The design already is modified to be adapted according to the shape of the arm. So we're going to use the connector to rig this arm in a kind of advanced way, controlling all the details. So this arm is just made of shape layers pre-composed to be able to add this white stroke around all these layers. So we're also going to see how we can rig this arm even if there's a pre-composition with the hair, which is outside of the pre-comp here. So we're going to see all of this. Let's start by the base rig of this arm with a bone for the shoulder to have a more detailed, more realistic animation. So I'm just adding the pivots of this arm, the joints, to create an arm armature with the shoulder bone. So the first thing here is that usually I parent the layers before running the auto rig to make sure everything works, but as the arm is pre-composed, I cannot use the After Effects parenting to link the layers to the bones, but I can use in the Links and Constraint panel of Duik the Parent Across Comp tool. So let's just first select the child layer in the pre-composition, for example here the arm, and in the panel in Duik I can select the parent, first the composition containing the parent, and then I can select the parent layer, which here is the bone for the arm. Duik creates a new layer, which is the locator. It is used to do the link, the parent link, using expressions or association properties between the two compositions. Let's do the same with the forearm, parent across comps. To the arm ring, I'm selecting the bone for the forearm and parent across comp. And again, I can do the same with the hands, parent across comps, to the bone of the hand. Now, let's test in the rigged composition. When the bone rotates, you have this parent link, even if the layers are inside the pre-composition, and the white stroke works well around all the three layers like this. Let's parent just the hair to the forearm. And now I can select the bones to run the auto rig on this armature to finish the rig of this arm. And then let's just hide these bones. Don't lock them, we may need them later. Let's just hide them to check how it works. So this is the base rig for the arm, and you can see all the issues we have because of the anchor points, the shape of the layers. So we're going to see how we can use the connector to finish this rig and improve all these shapes according to the rotations of the bones of the arm. To finish the rig of this arm using the connector, you can follow the comprehensive video course about Duik Ángela on RxLaboratory.org. The link is in the description of this video.